Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the study of the biblical kings of Israel. Great to see everybody here. Shalom, good morning. We've got a lot of beautiful stuff to review today as we are introduced further into the life of one of the most fascinating, colorful prophets of Israel. He was the protege of Elijah the prophet, and his name is Elisha. Good morning from Chicago to Rob and Harvey. Great to see you both. Thank you for joining us here, and to our friends on YouTube as well. We are delighted to have you with us. So, in the past week, Elisha, as the one who had the curious request of his master Elijah on the day of his death, that he be double as great as his master Elijah, and indeed that was fulfilled, as Elijah performs 8 miracles in his life, and Elisha performs 16 miracles in his life. Let's hear some more of these wonderful miracles that Elisha performs as we continue the study of Elisha's life. I'm not sure what Barbara Siegel-Hark is asking a translation. Which language would you like this translation translated into? I'm talking in English. I'm not sure if I said anything else in Hebrew. Let me know if I said something which you didn't understand. I'd be happy to translate. Welcome, Barbara. Nice to have you with us. So, Elisha, here he is. Good morning, Elaine. Here he is, Elisha, and the story goes as follows. Just remember, the stories that we know from the Torah, we are the people of the book. We tend to be very familiar with the stories of the 5 books of Moses and far less familiar with the stories of our prophets. And that's what this class is about. Remember that the Torah is made up, the written Torah is made up of 3 parts. The Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets, and the writings of the Torah, which include collectively Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. It spells Tanakh as an acronym, Tanakh. So what we're studying in the prophets is the middle section of the Tanakh of the written Torah, very, very vital and fundamental understanding. So we've mentioned an interesting character by the name of Ovadia. Ovadia was the person who was God-fearing, that happened to have been in the good graces of the wicked king Achav and his non-Jewish wife Isabel, who ruled and persecuted the Jewish people at that time. Now, even though Achav, we learned about him weeks ago, even though King Achav was a Jewish king and he was a prolific Torah scholar, nevertheless, he served idols and introduced idols to the land of Israel. He forced idolatry into the land of Israel, and he committed many grave and violent sins. Nevertheless, even though he was hunting down the prophets of God to kill them, Ovadia was a wealthy man who used his own wealth to hide 100 of the prophets of God in 2 caves, where he fed them from his own wealth. Let's hear the story of Ovadia as it ties into the stories of Elisha and Elijah. Now remember, Elijah was running away from King Achav and Queen Isabel. Elijah was a prophet of God. Ovadia at that time was sustaining with his own wealth and providing for the needs of 100 prophets of God whom he was hiding from King Achav and Queen Isabel, who were trying to kill them. So Ovadia was a wealthy man. He was righteous and straight before God. And even though he was God-fearing, nevertheless, somehow King Achav liked him, and he didn't hurt him, even though he was on a witch hunt to kill all the prophets of God. So despite the fact that Queen Isabel made a decree to kill all the prophets of Hashem, because she wanted only the prophets of idolatry to be alive, nevertheless, Ovadia somehow was able to slip through that evil order. 100 prophets of God were saved by Ovadia, because he was a friend of the king. He hid them in caves in the mountains, and from his own money he supported them. In the merit of this great mitzvah, he merited to experience divine prophecy. So he actually became a prophet. Good morning, Terry and Lucy, our nurse. Thank you very much for your service to on the front lines of the coronavirus. And Marty, also shalom to you. So he actually became a prophet of God. He experienced the prophecy, became known as Ovadia the prophet because of the merit of his great self-sacrifice in sustaining the prophets of God. Hashem said, Ovadia the righteous, who lives between 2 wicked people, King Achav and Queen Isabel, and he did not learn from their wicked ways, should be worthy of prophecy over Edom, over the Christians, who are descended from Esau, the wicked Esau, who grew up between two righteous people, Yitzchak, his father, and Rivka, his mother, and he didn't learn from their deeds. So Avadia, who didn't learn from the two evil influences in his life, should prophesy over Esau, over Edom, Esav, who grew up between two righteous people, whom he also did not learn from. Even after Achav died, and we've learned a lot about Achav's death and the prophecies of his death, his son Yehoram ruled over the people of Israel, over the 10 tribes, and he also was an idol worshiper. Even then, when Achav was already dead and his son took over, the prophets of God were still afraid to come out of their hiding place, and Ovadia continued to sustain them in secret. When he ran out of money, he literally supported them to his last drop. Hi, Zevi. And his last penny. He still did not give up on the prophets. And rather, what he did was, he borrowed money at great interest from Yehoram. I'm giving class. What? Thank you, Zevi. My son is giving me some information. Thank you, Zevi. That's very sweet of you. So nice thing that you built there. So what he did was he borrowed money from the king Yehoram to bring food to the prophets who were afraid to come out. Now he borrowed it with high interest. Now Jews are not allowed to borrow money or lend money to other Jews with interest. So this itself is a grave sin. Apparently, Ovadia borrowed money at interest. I don't know how he got around this. I don't know how a righteous person is able to borrow money from a Jew at interest. Unless they do what they do in today's banks in Israel, for example. There is how does a bank do business in Israel, for example? How do you lend money to other Jewish people without charging interest? If a bank wouldn't charge interest, then the bank would have no way of making money. So what happened was that they invented something called a heter iska, which is like a kosher certificate that you actually see on Israeli banks and private Jewish lenders that lend money. It's called a heter iska, which means a permission to do business. What it really does is that it redefines the partnership, the relationship from a borrower and a lender charging interest to a sharing of the future profits. It becomes, from a loan, it becomes a partnership agreement. It's an interesting law because nobody was willing to lend money anymore. And that was basically probably how Ovadia was able to loan money at high interest. Now here's what happens. Ovadia now passes away. And his wife is left a widow, she and her 2 sons, without any means of supporting themselves, no life insurance, nothing. Not only did they run out of money and she lost her husband, but also Yehoram the king sent her a message. He sent his servants and he said, his command was, your husband owes me a lot of money. If you don't return the money immediately to me, I will take both of your sons as slaves for me. Now the widow, she was terrified. She was crying and she begged them, but they wouldn't listen to her. No money and no possessions does she have to return the loan to the king. Nevertheless, and the servants of the king were truly wicked like him. They didn't listen. The king commanded to bring the money or the sons. Either the money or the sons are coming back home. And indeed, they almost took her sons forcibly, having no other choice. The widow went to the cemetery. She went to the place where her husband, the righteous Ovadia, was buried. She stood over there and she cried out, the one who fears God. A heavenly voice came out from between the graves and said, there are 4 God-fearing, Abraham, Joseph, Job, and Ovadia. Which one do you want? Abraham, Joseph, Job, and Ovadia. That's pretty impressive that her husband was in that list of 4 people that the heavenly voice was calling for. That she was able to have her husband in that list. I'd like to call my husband, she says. I'd like to speak to my husband. He was very God-fearing. Now, from heaven, they showed her somehow the grave, the bier of her husband, of her deceased husband. She bowed before the grave and she cried with great pain in her heart, and she said, my master, my husband, She calls out, I and the children, our children, are in great distress. The king has commanded to take them as slaves, and we have no money to repay your debt. What should we do? Through a miracle, the woman heard the voice of her husband telling her as follows. Take the little bit of oil that you have left in the house, and go to Elisha the prophet. Let him bless you and say to him, I didn't borrow money for my own honor. Didn't borrow money from the king for my own honor. God will help you because I did this for God's sake. 100 prophets I hid in a cave, and I supported them with all their needs. There was candle lighting all the time in the cave, and it never went out, not by day, not by night, so that they could continue to serve God because I supported them, not for myself, not for the members of my household that I borrowed the money from the king, and therefore it's not upon me or upon you, my wife, to return this money. So shall you tell the prophet Elisha, ask him to say these words before the master of the universe. So what we're about to experience right now is one of the great miracles of Elisha. We read about it in the Torah soon after Simchas Torah in Parashas Chayei Sarah, near the beginning of Genesis. And the message behind this story is actually a very profound spiritual message. I'm going to share that with you in just a few moments after we cover this very important miracle of Elisha and the cruse of oil. So, fortified in her trust in God, she goes to Elisha and she cries before him. She says, my husband died, he left me nothing except for a great loan before the king. And now the king Jehoram wants to take my sons as slaves. Please save us. You know that my husband was very God-fearing. What have you in the house? The prophet asked her. And she answered, I only have one small plate with a little bit of oil in it. If so, do the following, said the prophet Elisha. Go to your neighbors and borrow from them vessels. Empty vessels you should borrow. After that, lock the door. You and your children should be inside, and start pouring that little bit of oil that you have in your pitcher or your saucer. Pour it into the empty vessels that are in your house, all the empty vessels that you borrowed, and God will bless you and God will save you. That woman hurried home. She followed exactly the instruction of the prophet Elisha, and in front of her eyes and in front of her children's eyes, there was a great miracle. All the vessels started filling up from that tiny bit of oil that she poured, and it started flowing and it never stopped flowing. She had so much oil, the oil filled up all the vessels in her house. She then took the broken vessels in her house and she said, he who said to the empty vessels that they should be filled with oil, may he say to broken vessels that they should be fixed and they also should be filled with oil. That's quite a gutsy declaration. And indeed, another miracle happened, and the broken vessels became new vessels. And they also filled up with oil, where the oil kept on flowing without ceasing until every last vessel was filled. The woman joyfully went to the prophet and told him about the salvation of God. She divided off some of the oil as a donation to God, what's called the obligation of truma. Everything that we own, we're supposed to donate a portion to God, especially from the agricultural component. She wanted to donate truma and meiser, which are biblical tithes that we're supposed to give to the temple. But Elisha told her, no, you do not need to give any tithes, because from something which you obtain through a miracle like this oil, you don't need to tithe. You only need to tithe naturally earned produce. You don't need to tithe miraculously earned produce. And you have nothing to worry about the servants of the king. Elisha calmed her down. She told him to, Elisha told the woman that you wanted to worry about the king demanding to know your income, where your money suddenly came from, because if they'll ask how you suddenly became so rich, then they'll want to tax your income. Income tax, I guess, is also in the Bible, right? So he said to her, don't worry about it. They will not know where your money came from to return the payment to the king, because God has blocked up their mouths, just like you blocked the mouths of the dogs in Egypt when the Jewish people came out of Egypt to freedom. So too, he will block their mouths and he will blind their eyes to the point that they won't be able to ask you where your money is from and what you did in order to obtain it. When she asked what to do with the oil, Elisha told her, sell it. Much money she received when she sold the oil. She returned her entire loan to the king. And she lived in great wealth and honor with her 2 sons for the rest of her life. And when she died, she left them a great inheritance. So that, my friends, is the first story we learned today about Elisha's miracle. Remember, this is Elisha. He's a greater prophet than Elijah, his master. So that's quite a story. We read about that story in the Haftarah of Parashat Chayei Sarah, near the beginning of the Torah. And the Rebbe points out a fascinating insight on this story. You see, when Elisha tells her to fill up empty vessels, to bring empty vessels and to pour the oil into empty vessels, there's a profound spiritual message for us here as well. And that message is as follows. The oil represents, the tiny bit of oil is like the oil in the Hanukkah story, which was that little bit of purity that could not be contaminated by the Greek invaders in the Hanukkah story, where that one cruse of oil was left over, that one cruse of oil that was able to burn. It represents a Jew. This woman, the woman in the story, she represents you and me. It's our soul. Our godly soul is like a woman married to God. Like our godly soul is married to God. So this woman cries out. She says, I've got nothing left. I've lost all my inspiration. I've lived in this physical world for so long. My godly soul, the godly soul, I'm so trapped in my physical body and my animal soul so deep and so long that I'm losing my 2 sons. My 2 sons would be love and fear of God. I'm not even sensitized anymore to my relationship with God. My husband has died, so to speak, like a reference to God. Like I don't even have a relationship with God anymore. And all I have left is a little tiny cruse of oil. My pintel yid, like we call it, the essence of my soul, is all that I have left within me. It's just a tiny little bit. And many of us can identify with this reality. When we realize that we are not spiritually inspired, we are proudly and fiercely Jewish. We all know people like this, that don't practice any Judaism, but they're fiercely Jewish. If you go over to them and you say, you're a guy, you're not a Jew, they'll be deeply offended. So they have that sense of Jewish pride, that Yiddish neshama, the Jewish soul they have there, but it has no expression, it has no manifestation. It's like they've lost all their resources. That's the woman of the story. And what the prophet tells this woman is that if you want to nurture your relationship with God, if you want to nurture your spirituality, you want to nurture your holiness, your kedusha, your soul, what you need to do is bring empty vessels and pour the little tiny bit of oil into those empty vessels. What that means is, in our spiritual service, you have a soul. You showed up in Shul and Yom Kippur, and that's it. Fill up empty vessels means do action mitzvahs that are void of content. Lay the tefillin even though you don't feel it. Have a Shabbos dinner even though you don't connect spiritually. Make the kiddush, go to shul, study Torah, put up a mezuzah, check your mezuzah, make sure it's kosher. Light your Shabbos candles, do a mitzvah. And what's going to happen is that the empty observance of the mitzvah will cause the soul, that little tiny bit of oil that's inside of you, to flow without ceasing. And you'll see that your empty vessels will now become full. Your empty actions will now become filled with feeling and emotion. You know, it's a lot like the expression in English. We say, build it and they will come. Build it and they will come. In Hasidic parlance, we say that the vessels draw the light. If you're not feeling loving towards your spouse or your children, if you say loving words, even though they're empty, you'll notice that the words soon fill up with emotion. When you say, I love you, and you say loving and endearing words, then those empty words soon start to fill up with feeling. They well up. It's a fascinating concept. And the same thing goes with prayer with God. This is why we pray to God. Physically and spiritually semi-conscious, and we lay the tefillin, we put on our talis, we start to daven. And what do? We say words of affirmation expressing our love of God, even though we don't necessarily feel that. The reason that we do that is because it's the love that's expressed in our words that draws the soul within us. When you say the words of prayer and you understand their meaning, you think about the words of prayer. You don't rush through it. You think about the words. You meditate a little bit before davening. You meditate maybe during davening. You think about what you're saying. What happens now is that those empty vessels draw the light upon you, and you start to feel a love of God. Try it. You'll see it's an amazing thing. So that's what's going on with this story of Elisha, far from just being an ancient story, which is maybe a little bit difficult to believe, depending on your degree of suspended reality and godly intervention in our lives. Instead of looking at this story as something which is purely historical, think of it in the current present tense as a metaphor to your own spiritual reality, to your relationship with your spouse, your parents, and your children, people close to you. Think about it in terms of the relationship that you have with God. Think about it in terms of your business. And God will bless you in all that you do. What does that mean in Psalms, King David's Psalms? And God, or in the Torah it says that actually. And God will bless you in all that you do. It means do empty actions. You make investments. You make deals. Negotiate. Do what you need to do. And God will bring the light into your vessels. God will make the oil flow into your vessels. You are not the master of your livelihood. I think we all know that you can try 10 times to knock on 10 different doors and they all shut before you, but then suddenly you notice that an 11th door opens and the blessing comes from elsewhere. When we really meditate upon the source of our livelihood, we realize it's not our genius, it's not our mind and heart that creates our livelihood. We only create the vessels into which God pours miraculous oil. And that is the metaphor of the miracle of Elisha, which we are learning today. The path forward when you're feeling stuck, whether it's emotionally stuck, financially stuck, spiritually stuck. It's a very, very profound message to bring empty vessels and don't stop trying. Pour your oil into empty vessels, even though there's no hope. Make vessels for godly blessing into your livelihood. Make vessels for emotional flow into your relationships. Make vessels for your connection with God spiritually through doing empty mitzvahs, through saying empty words of love, through making futile attempts, not futile, but through making attempts at business. And what's going to happen is you'll notice that with prayer, God will make, with faith and trust, God will allow your oil to flow. It's the most remarkable truth. I don't know if it's scientifically proven, but this is a message that we draw from the prophets in today's lesson here, the lesson of the flow of oil. Any questions, friends? Do we have any questions here today in our daily Torah study here today? Please let me know if you got any questions. The next story is actually quite a long one. It's a long story relating to another miracle, many miracles of Elisha, which we learn. But I think it's a very powerful message with which I think we can end today's Torah study. The message of empty vessels serving as vehicles to draw the light upon you in every aspect of your life. I hope that you found this inspiring and interesting, friends. Feel free to always send me an email to rabbi@jewishgardens.com. We'd love to hear from you. That's rabbi@jewishgardens.com. Just a quick reminder that this week on Wednesday and Thursday and maybe Friday, I'll be heading home by car. We were driving the family from New York to Florida, and there won't be Torah study on Wednesday and Thursday morning this week. So tomorrow morning there'll still be Torah study with Tanya at 8:30. Tomorrow morning we're doing chapter 36 of Tanya. Today at noon is going to be the Zoom class in Tehillim and Hebrew reading by Corey. That's noon at Zoom. And we'll see you tomorrow morning for Tanya, tomorrow morning at 8:30. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thank you for joining us everyone here today. Don't forget, you can always listen to the previous classes in the series, the Biblical History series, at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. That's youtube.com/Jewish Gardens under the Biblical History series playlist. It's a playlist called Biblical History. And if anybody would like to dedicate daily, weekly, or monthly Torah study, you can do that in honor or in memory of a loved one or someone special at jewishgardens.com/donate. That's jewishgardens.com/donate, or by calling 561-624-2223. Sorry, that's 561-624-2223. Thank you very much, everybody. Shalom, Marty. Shalom, everyone, and have a wonderful day.